first time Matthew McConaughey heard the tape, it was already too late, because the truth has a way of arriving only after silence has done its damage. And the voice on the recording was thin and shaking, the voice of a man who had carried guilt longer than fear, whispering that they told him no one would believe him anyway, and that single sentence cracked something open inside Matthew as he stood in the same Texas town that had raised him, a place where oil money bought smiles, handshakes, and silence, where a teenage girl had vanished 16 years earlier, and the town agreed to forget her, calling her a runaway, calling it tragedy, calling it over, while her family kept waiting for a door that never opened. And Matthew, home to bury his father, found himself instead digging up a lie so deep it had grown roots, because every door he knocked on closed politely. Every person remembered everything except the truth. And the sheriff who signed off on the case now held power. The judge who dismissed evidence owned land, and the men who should have protected the innocent had built their lives on the comfort of being untouchable. Until the tape appeared with no name and no mercy, a confession from the deputy everyone said was senile. A man who had disappeared months earlier, but now spoke clearly about how the girl wasn't taken by a stranger, but by the son of the most powerful man in town, how evidence vanished. Witnesses were threatened, and justice was folded neatly and put away. And in that moment, Matthew understood the irony that the system designed to protect the truth had spent years protecting the lie. So he didn't take the tape to the police or the courts. He took it to the public, and the silence shattered, and phones rang, and old witnesses remembered, and the men who once ruled from behind closed doors stood exposed in daylight, trembling, stripped of the authority they had mistaken for permanence, and the power shifted violently and fast. The sheriff resigned, the judge was arrested, and the oil baron's son, now gray and respected, was led away in cuffs, finally feeling the fear he had buried in someone else's child. And when the gavel fell, Matthew sat quietly in the back. No smile, no tears, just the weight of knowing that justice is not loud, it does not celebrate. It simply arrives when fear runs out of places to hide. And the final lesson settled in his chest like a truth that could not be undone. That power can silence people for years, but it can never silence the truth forever. And when it finally rises, it does not ask permission. It only demands to be seen. After the verdict, the town tried to breathe again, but the air felt different, heavier, like it remembered everything it had been forced to hold. And Matthew stayed longer than he planned, walking streets that now looked smaller, weaker, stripped of the illusion that power had once given them, because justice had not only taken men away, it had taken their masks, and that scared people more than prison ever could. And at night, he listened to the town whisper, old conversations finally finishing themselves, mothers admitting they had known, fathers admitting they had looked away, and children learning that heroes could be wrong. And the most painful irony was this, that the truth everyone feared had not destroyed them. It had freed them, because once the lie died, something else began to grow, slow and fragile but real. And then Matthew received a letter with no return address, the handwriting unsteady but familiar, from the deputy's sister, who said he died believing his confession would mean nothing, that he thought the tape would be lost, like the girl had been. And Matthew folded the letter carefully, understanding that justice is rarely about who sees it happen, but who it finally reaches. Because that night, he stood alone at the edge of town where the girl had last been seen. And for the first time in 16 years there was no silence there. Only wind, only space, only release, and the final truth became unavoidable. That justice is not a moment, it is a transfer, a burden passed from the brave to the living, and when people choose to carry it, even late, even afraid, even broken, the past loosens its grip, and the future finally has room to exist. Years later, when the documentaries aired and the town's name became shorthand for corruption and redemption, Matthew watched from a distance, knowing the story everyone told was still incomplete, because the real ending was quieter, and it lived in the lives that kept moving forward, like the girl's mother who finally sold the house where hope had calcified into pain, or the kids who grew up learning that silence was a choice, not a rule. And the greatest irony remained that the men who once believed they controlled everything were now remembered only as a warning. Footnotes in a story about truth they failed to outrun, while the deputy's tape once feared now sat in an archive labeled evidence, not rumor. And Matthew understood then that justice doesn't just punish, it teaches. It rewrites the moral memory of a place. And one evening, he returned to the courthouse steps where the crowd had once gathered, now empty and ordinary. And he realized the power had shifted again, not to a person, not to a family, not to a system, but to the people themselves, because they had learned the cost of looking away, and the final lesson settled like something earned rather than given, that justice is not guaranteed by laws or leaders, but by ordinary people who decide the truth matters more than comfort. And when that choice is made, even the longest darkness loses its authority. In the end, long after the headlines faded and the town slipped back into anonymity, Matthew realized the story had never really been about the men who fell or the power that collapsed, but about the moment people chose to stop pretending, because justice had been served not just in a courtroom, but in the quiet ways the town lived differently, in the way doors stayed open, in the way questions were finally allowed. And the most bitter irony was that the truth everyone feared had not ruined them. It had saved them from becoming what they protected. And one morning, Matthew drove out past the oil fields where the lie had once been born, watching the sun rise over land that no longer felt owned, and he understood the final lesson with a clarity that stayed, that justice is not a single act or a single hero. It is a chain of courage passed forward, and when even one person refuses to carry a lie any longer, the weight of history shifts, and the world, however slowly, begins to correct itself. The last thing Matthew did before leaving for good was stop at the cemetery, where the headstones told quieter truths than the living ever had, and he stood between the deputy's grave and the girl's marker, understanding that justice had finally connected what fear had kept apart, because both had been waiting for the same thing, to be believed. And as the wind moved through the grass, he felt the strange calm that only comes when something unfinished is finally laid down. And the dramatic irony lingered like a final echo, that the town's greatest crime had not been what was done in the dark, but how long it had been protected in the light. And now that protection was gone, stripped away by ordinary people who had decided silence was more dangerous than truth. And as Matthew drove away, he knew the ending was complete, not because everything was healed, but because the balance had been restored, and the final lesson settled like a promise rather than a warning, that justice may arrive late and wounded, but when it comes, it changes who we are, and that change is the truest verdict of all. And long after Matthew was gone, long after his name stopped being mentioned when the story was told, the town kept changing in ways no camera ever recorded, because justice, once invited in, refused to leave, and people who had lived their whole lives lowering their voices now spoke plainly, openly, teaching their children the names of mistakes so they would never repeat them. And the courthouse that once swallowed truth now displayed it, with records unsealed and stories preserved, not to shame but to remember. And the deepest irony of all settled into the soil itself, that the men who once believed they owned the town had vanished into history, while the girl they tried to erase became the measure of its conscience. And every year, on the anniversary of the verdict, someone left flowers where she was last seen. Not because they were ordered to, but because they chose to. And in that choice lived the final transformation, the one no sentence could deliver, because justice had moved from paper into people. And as time passed, the lesson grew stronger instead of weaker, that evil survives only where silence feeds it. And when silence breaks, even the smallest truth can outlive power, fear, and time itself. Decades later, when the last of the old men were gone, and even their names sounded distant, the story still lived, not as scandal, but as inheritance. Passed down in classrooms, kitchens, and quiet drives home. And the children who once watched their parents whisper now asked questions without fear, because the town had learned that the truth did not need permission anymore. And the final irony settled gently but firmly, that the justice everyone once thought was impossible had become ordinary, woven into daily life, into how people voted, how they listened, how they refused to look away. And somewhere far from that place, Matthew heard that a new courthouse had been built. Not bigger, not grander, just open, with glass walls that let the light in. And he smiled at the thought without needing to see it, because he understood what it meant. That justice had completed its longest journey, from secrecy to sunlight, from fear to habit. And the last lesson endured like something carved into stone, that when one generation chooses courage, the next inherits freedom. And that is how justice finally wins, not once, but forever.